Hey there, and welcome to all my fellow Christian creatives out there. This is Tim Risto, host of the Creative Christians Podcast. Welcome back to another episode of AfterThoughts, where I discuss all things related to Christians and creatives and creativity and faith in between my production of episodes of the Creative Christians Podcast. So as most of you know, I'm hard at work on the next episode of the Creative Christians Podcast, all about faith-based films. And today I was going to go ahead and talk a little bit about some of that, since I'm getting into watching a ton of faith-based films and starting to do some research on that leading up to the next episode. I thought, I could talk a little bit about that in Afterthoughts. But I didn't really want to give away too much of what will be coming up in the podcast. So I thought, no, I'll wait. There will be some things that I'll be able to talk about faith-based films, probably next week's Afterthoughts, that won't be in the episode. So it'll be some additional content and won't spoil anything for the episode. But I will say, Tracy and I finished watching Woodlawn last night. Great film, powerful film, really well done. And I also watched Risen a few nights ago. That was also very good. We've moved into an era where there's a lot better faith-based films than there used to be, both in terms of production quality, but also in terms of storytelling. So we'll have a lot to dig into there in the podcast. Today I want to talk about writing. I want to talk about a particular book that I've read. And I want to talk about getting your creative works out there, not always waiting for things to be perfect, but stepping out and creating things, not waiting for the perfect moment all the time, making sure we do excellent work, of course, but sometimes just putting it out there. And that ties into the book that I read that I'm going to share with you today. Also, we're going to talk about forgiveness. That's part of what this book is about too. So what book am I talking about? I'm talking about this book right here called The Storm on Our Shores. It's by Mark Obmascik, I believe is how you pronounce his name. And as far as I know, he is not a Christian or Christian author, just from my briefly reading his profile and a little bit about his bio. I could be wrong on that, but from what I've been able to tell, he's not a Christian. If I'm wrong, I apologize, Mark. But he is a very good author, and he's a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist. He's written several books. This is one of them. This one came out, I believe, in 2019, and it is not a faith-based book either. So you may be asking, well, why here on Afterthoughts, all about creative Christians, are you bringing up an author who's not a Christian and a book that's not a faith-based book? Well, because there is a wonderful thread that runs through this book of faith. And this book is also probably one of the most powerful books I've read in recent years of a story of grace, redemption, forgiveness. And it's a true story. So what is this about? As it says here on the front, one island, two soldiers, and the forgotten battle of World War II. That forgotten battle of World War II is part of why I picked this book up. Most of us who have any sense of history and of World War II, which I'm a big fan of that period of history, of reading about and watching films about, understood that World War II, one of the only battles fought on American soil, was the attack on Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. Well, as it turns out, this quote-unquote forgotten battle of World War II was fought on American soil as well, and I had not been aware of that. This story is about the Battle of Attu. That's Attu. And that was a battle fought on one of the Aleutian Islands. Attu is one of the Aleutian Islands. The Aleutian Islands are those string of islands, kind of that finger that comes out from Alaska. And Attu is one of those islands. A very remote, desolate, barren, unforgiving environment. It was a place where, it's foggy all the time, rainy, cold, dreary. I think the sun only appears like 7 or 8 days out of the year. The soil there is kind of this spongy-like soil. So, you land on the beach and you step onto it and, you sink up to your ankle, basically, or your knee, in this terrain. Very difficult to traverse. There's mountains with snow caps. Just a very difficult environment to survive in, much less fight a battle in. So in World War II, the Japanese actually captured Attu at one point, intending to use it as a base of operations to then attack the American mainland. This happened after Pearl Harbor, of course, so there was already concern on the part of the Americans about attacks coming to California, to the West Coast. And so the Japanese saw this as a potential. What if we move up to the Aleutian Islands, take over an island there, and use that as a point of operations to then head towards the American mainland or attack further up into Alaska, things like that. So that was the strategy. There was a small village on Attu at the time. They attacked it and ultimately took over and captured American soil in World War II. And this was the first time this had happened since, I think, like the War of 1812 or something like that, that America had lost soil to an enemy. And that's part of why you don't hear about this battle very much. It was an embarrassment to the American military and the government that we had lost, American soil for the first time in a long time. It also proved to just be an embarrassment for both sides because it proved to be a brutal, brutal battle with a huge loss of life. I think the worst up until Iwo Jima at that time. And was not really a success in the end. America ultimately recaptured it. The Japanese launched a banzai attack, basically a suicide attack near the end, and it just proved to be this brutal, awful battle. So those are all parts of the reasons why we don't hear much about that. But it's a fascinating story, and interwoven into that are two soldiers that this story highlights. One Japanese soldier, Paul Tatsuguchi, who actually loved both America and Japan. Born in Japan, but then studied in medical school in California in America. And I think was a surgeon, if I remember correctly, or was still training to be a surgeon. But it follows his story, and then it also follows an American soldier, Dick Laird, and his story. Paul Tatsuguchi is really the larger part of that, but their lives both intersect and form the characters really that we follow, the people that we follow through this story, as well as their wives and some children, some relatives. So it's not complicated. The writing is very good. The story is only about 230 pages long. It's divided into 4 parts. The first part is about Paul Tatsuguchi. Second part is about Dick Laird. Third part is all about wartime and the battle on Attu, and a little bit after that until the war ends. And then the fourth part is all about peacetime and what happens after the war. So I'm going to go into some spoiler territory here because it's the only way I can talk about some of these fascinating themes and this idea of forgiveness and redemption that comes out of this. So if you haven't read the book and you are interested in reading it, I'd recommend reading it and then come back and watch the video because I'm going to get a little spoilery here. It's the only way to talk about some of the things in it. First off, both Paul Tatsuguchi and Dick Laird are broken people. They've had difficult things in their lives going on. Dick Laird is from Appalachia, I believe, and was a coal miner and was very young and, had a lot of different family issues and relationship issues and things like that. Was not, he was a little bit of a hellion, I guess you could say, a little bit of a rebel, got into trouble at times and things like that. But he was also very, committed. And when he entered the military, proved to be a valuable asset there. And Paul Tatsuguchi also had a lot of different kind of family and relational type issues. Had to walk this fine line between loving America and loving Japan during wartime, and how he was perceived by both sides. Like I said, he studied in California, met his wife, and I think started a family. They moved back to Japan, and it was at that point that he was conscripted into the Japanese Imperial Army. So that's how he ended up fighting for Japan. Dick Laird, of course, was in America and fought as an American soldier. Their lives intersect essentially on the island of Attu during the battle. And here's where I'll get spoilery right here. There's, again, it's a very graphic depiction of battle. There's a lot of very brutal things that are told. Laird is on the landing force there to recapture Attu. Paul Tatsuguchi, I believe, was already there with the Japanese force by the time Dick Laird gets there. They never really meet, which is the interesting thing. But near the end of the battle, which again was brutal, Paul Tatsuguchi is medical. He's not really a fighter, soldier per se, but he is put in charge of a lot of the field hospitals. Helping with the wounded, dealing with protecting the soldiers during American assault and attacks, which often happen, right outside the hospitals or these field hospitals or on the hospitals. So he's got a perspective on different aspects of the battle from his points of view. Paul Tatsuguchi started to write a diary. And here's where I reference the whole idea of doing our creative works, getting our creative works out there. He wrote this diary as a way to communicate with his family back home, which he had a feeling he would never see again, and his wife and his daughter at the time, and actually another daughter that was born after he left that he never met. And so he starts this diary to kind of recount things. Of course, he has to be careful about what he says because the military, of course, Japanese army will review this before any of these things get back to his wife and family. And, he can't name locations where they're at, things like that. So he has to be kind of vague about some things. His background, of course, he's not terribly emotional, so some of it's just a little more informative. But he does relay a number of things in this diary, in this accounting of his time on Attu. And ultimately, at the end, where he knows the Japanese are losing, American forces have overrun the island, and before the Japanese begin this banzai attack on the Americans, he writes his final entry and basically says goodbye to his family and his wife and his daughter and the daughter he's never met and parents and things like that. And eventually, later on, to jump ahead, this diary gets discovered much later on. It makes the rounds of American and Japanese soldiers, but Americans in particular are touched by it because what they saw during the battle throughout World War II as such a nefarious, deadly enemy, vicious enemy, is now humanized by reading his diary and recognizing he's a human being too. That the enemy is fearful, is scared, has families, is not just a brutal killing machine. It humanizes the enemy to the Americans. It humanizes the Japanese to the Americans. So the impact that diary ends up having for all sorts of people, American and Japanese. It gets passed around, it gets mimeographed. This is before the internet, of course, so it gets mimeographed, it gets handwritten, ends up being like 10 or 12 different versions of his diary with some, discrepancies between them that end up making it out. It becomes this kind of famous document that has an impact in people's lives. Talks a little bit about his faith, I believe. Talks about his family. It talks about, of course, what was happening on Attu on a day-by-day basis. So it becomes a very significant document that touches people's lives in unique ways. Ultimately, going back to when really Tatsuguchi and Laird meet is in battle. Again, they don't literally meet, though. The bonsai attack has started, and Laird is caught up in the chaos of it. And there's a Japanese sniper nest, I believe, or mortar nest, firing on his location as he's trying to make his way through the fog and the chaos of I think, an early morning bonsai attack. And he ends up throwing a grenade or several grenades into this nest and killing the Japanese soldiers. Well, then when he goes to check out the nest, they're under orders as Americans to confiscate any documents that may help the American government understand, the Japanese attack plans and all that. So he confiscates things unknowingly at the time, not recognizing, but he gets Tatsuguchi's diary. And that's kind of how that ultimately in time gets disseminated throughout. Not realizing the importance of it at the time. But that's really their connection. He sees him as a dead soldier, not really recognizing who he is. Later on, as he is able to read the diary and, understands the importance of it, he recognizes as well the humanity of the enemy and realizing that he killed somebody that was Japanese and American. So when I talk about at the beginning, about getting our works out there, just stepping into and doing your creative works, not always waiting for the precise moment or the perfect moment to do it. Sometimes just get started, get going, just do it. I was talking about this aspect of, here was Paul Tatsuguchi, who in the heat of battle many times was writing these diary entries and just getting something out there. Again, this wasn't for the purpose of a creative work. It was to communicate to his family and to make sure there was an accurate document of what happened on Attu, which even that is a little bit in question because he was sometimes relaying information that was relayed, propaganda relayed from the Japanese army to the soldiers there on Attu. So there are some discrepancies there too. But overall, it's something that, again, heartfelt in many regards that he put out there. And it touched people's lives. So the value of stepping in and doing writing, creative work of any kind, and getting it out there. You don't know whose lives you might touch, and it may happen after you're gone. But don't let that stop you from producing your creative works, from doing what you feel you need to do, saying what you need to say through your creativity and through your works. I want to read here a quick part from, this is page 150 of The Storm on Our Shores by Mark Obmascik. And here it talks again about his diary. Tatsuguchi's diary, however, proved to Laird again is the American soldier, that the Japanese were human too. Like U.S. soldiers on Attu, Tatsuguchi was cold and scared and hungry and sick and brave. Most of all, Tatsuguchi had offered a heartfelt confession of love for his wife and their daughters. Regardless of his native country, a long-deployed soldier could not help but be moved by a man bidding farewell to a 3-month-old daughter he had never met. They also were struck by the one undisputed truth. Neither the American GI nor the Japanese army surgeon wanted to be on Attu. In the aftermath of the battle, soldiers learned even more about Tatsuguchi and his background. As the Americans sorted through the detritus of war, they found other possessions of the Japanese surgeon that gave them pause. The first was Tatsuguchi's personal Bible. Inscribed with the doctor's favorite verse, "Choose life," which I believe is Deuteronomy 30:10 or something like that. The recovered scripture made Laird doubt his belief that the enemy in the Pacific was a pagan murderer. Just as in Japan, military brass in the United States did little to discourage racist hatred of the enemy. The realization that a Japanese and American soldier could share the same religion made Laird think twice about exactly who he was trying to kill. So there again, there's that thread too, and the fact that Tatsuguchi, that faith thread, the fact that Tatsuguchi had his favorite Bible verse, and it was "Choose life." all while being kind of indoctrinated while he was on Attu by the Japanese military with the message of serving the emperor, and dying rather than be captured, committing suicide rather than be captured. He had a lot of conflicting messages compared to what he had at home with his church. He was a Seventh-day Adventist. His Christian faith, his church, and his family, where he'd been daily surrounded by those messages. Now when he's away in battle, he's being indoctrinated and constantly fed the messages of the Japanese military and his fellow soldiers, So talk about struggling and a conflict of beliefs and having to deal with that in wartime, in battle. But his wife mentioned in some of the letters that started to come back from Attu during that time that she noticed a little shift in tone of him starting to talk more about serving the military. Now, whether or serving the emperor, and some of that shift in attitude a little bit. Now, whether a lot of that was said just, again, to get past the military censors that would be reading his letters, or whether that was an honest-to-goodness shift in his belief systems or attitudes, we'll never know because he was killed in combat. So, fascinating implications of faith and culture and and living out our lives there with that. Now, where all this story goes, and when we get to the forgiveness part of it, is we mentioned the daughter that he never met. Paul Tatsuguchi never met his daughter. And of course, Laird is the one who kills Tatsuguchi, the daughter's father. The book actually starts, this book, again, big spoiler territory here, but the book actually starts with this daughter, name's Laura, meeting Dick Laird. She doesn't know who he is, but he comes to her house. This is long after the war, of course, much later in life. Laura is older and married, I believe, has kids of her own. And Laird just shows up at her house, the stranger, and starts talking. And she doesn't know why he's there. And eventually it leads back out to his car. And before he gets ready to go, he says, "By the way, I'm the man who killed your father." And then he gets in and drives off. And it's not till years later that she tracks him down and they end up meeting. And, she discovers that Dick Laird is the man who killed her father that she never met. And realizes, too, that Dick Laird has carried this burden with him for all these years. And by the time they really have a chance to sit down and talk at any depth, Laird is, I think, in an old folks' home. I think he has oxygen. He's not the young man anymore, and but still carries this burden around with him. Where this all ends up heading, and again, the reason I bring this up, is Laura discovers a lot about her father, learns more and more about it from some of his colleagues in medical school who adored him, who had a perspective on him, and others. And she helps Laird to unburden himself from killing her father. She forgives him. And I'm not doing it justice by saying it that simply, but it's powerful the way that unfolds over the last, like I said, 3 or 4 chapters. So Laird and Paul Tatsuguchi's daughter, Laura, meet in a restaurant. And let me pick up here. It says, all these years later, Laird still didn't think he had done the wrong thing. He just could not identify the right thing. He feared he had killed an American. When I read the diary, Laird told her, I felt like I'd killed a husband, a father, and a Japanese man that had no business where he was at. Laura and Laird looked at each other, their eyes welled. Laura did not know what to say, so she told Laird the first thing that came to her mind. It was war. It was a long time ago, and you did what you thought you had to do. In the middle of the restaurant, Laura knew it. The man who killed her father did bear a burden. He had carried it inside himself for more than 5 decades. He could not rid himself of it, and now Laura knew what she wanted to do about it. She could not give him peace, but she could give him atonement. After dinner, she sat down and wrote him a letter. And I won't read the whole letter here, but it says, Dear Mr. Laird, it was so good to have had a chance to talk to you tonight. I'm writing this letter to express even more completely my gratitude to you for coming to my home so many years ago, and to ask you to let go of any feelings of guilt or pain you still have over what happened between you and my father at Attu. What happened there was neither your fault nor his. Neither you nor any of your comrades chose that particular battle or that particular time to fight. If fault lies with anyone, it lies with those commanding generals, all long dead, who decided to spend the lives of their men in what many believe to be a stupid battle over a useless and barren piece of land. That includes the Japanese generals who invaded for what must have been symbolic purposes, small and frozen islands that they could neither defend nor use, and who left men stranded there. It also includes the American military commanders who chose the worst of seasons to stage a battle that never needed fighting. Then at the end, the letter goes on like this: whatever happened out there that day and whatever painful flashes of memory still visit you, I ask you to let them go. I ask you to accept what happened and forgive yourself and to be at peace. And I want you to know that the daughter and the wife of Paul Tetsuguchi both hold you in honor and gratitude for coming forward and visiting our home that day, and wish you peace and happiness. With best regards, Laura Tetsuguchi Davis. The story goes on here. When Laura returned home to California, she read her letter aloud to her mother. Together they wept, but Teiko's, that's Paul Tetsuguchi's wife, but Teiko's tears turned into a smile. I miss my husband terribly, she told her daughter. Life was not easy without him, but life went on. We had to keep on. If you hold on to anger and animosity, it's going to eat you alive. You have to let it go. The guilt was eating at Mr. Laird. At his age, he wanted to feel peace. As Christians, we believe in forgiveness. I hope you have helped Mr. Laird move on. Laura's heart swelled. Her mother brimmed with so much grace. Faith may have given Teiko her roadmap to life, but she still chose every turn at every intersection. Laura wished she could match her mother's model of empathy. Of course, meeting with the man who killed her father required some courage by Laura, too. Her mother's serenity about the decision helped convince Laura that she had done the right thing. Laura wondered how Laird would react when he read her letter. A few days later, Laird wrote back to Laura with his answer: I don't mind telling you that your letter brought a tear to these eyes. I think you understand just what went on during the war. The night after the restaurant, Laird told Laura he slept without nightmares. And throughout the story after the war, of course, he's, as so many veterans had been and have been, confronted with regular nightmares about the things he saw in combat and war. So that's just a brief bit of the story, but there's this wonderful moment and moments throughout, and again at the end, these all come together with the daughter forgiving the man who killed her father. And again, bringing in some of that, the fact that Paul Tetsuguchi was a man of faith, his wife was a man of faith, and ultimately those things came down to inspire the daughter that Paul Tetsuguchi never met, and the daughter who never met her father, to forgive the man who killed her father. What a powerful statement on the power of forgiveness. And threaded through that is the example, even if it's not overt in this story, the fact that there's a biblical foundation there. Threaded through that is the fact that the example of forgiveness was set for us by Jesus Christ. Powerful. I'd highly recommend, if you're interested and if you're willing to put up with kind of a gut-wrenching story, but to learn about the lives of two people who intersected, who never really met, two soldiers on the battlefield, and about a brutal battle, read this book. Again, The Storm on Our Shores by Mark Obmascik. Very well written, well worth your time. And if you're not in tears by the end when you read about the level of forgiveness that it took, then where's your heart at? But powerful, powerful story. All right, I know this was a little longer afterthoughts today as I detailed about this book and the story that it tells. But when you discover a book, in this case one about war and a couple of soldiers, that isn't labeled as a faith-based book, that isn't set up as a faith-based book, And then you discover this strong thread of faith running through it, and of redemption and forgiveness at the end that has a faith component to it, a Christian faith component to it. It's a pleasant surprise and touching. And so I wanted to highlight that, because for me this was something that has not left my mind yet. Having finished, read it over a week or so ago, it still lingers with me. It's a powerful story. And so I just want to be able to share that element with you. The way God works through history and people's lives to produce results like this, an element of forgiveness, where a daughter who never met her father is able to forgive the man, the soldier, the man who took her father's life in the heat of battle. And just the power of forgiveness, that level is definitely, a God-breathed thing. So I wanted to highlight that, but also that second element, like I said. Paul Tatsuguchi's diary is an example for us as Christian creatives to step out and do our creative work. If we get overwhelmed by feelings of, a lack of confidence or an uncertainty about, what we're doing is going to make a difference, this to me, even though we may not be writing or producing our creative works under those kind of conditions or for those reasons, in wartime, under duress, putting out our last thoughts before we inevitably are, killed in combat. We're not mirroring those conditions necessarily, most of us. But the whole point here is, when you step out and do utilize your creative talents and gifts that God has blessed you with, you never know what the result will be. If Paul Tatsuguchi hadn't written that diary, you have to look at that series of events, would ultimately his daughter been in a position to forgive Dick Laird and free him up? If Laird hadn't read that diary and recognized that the enemy was human and that Paul Tatsuguchi was a human being just like him, with the nightmares and the torture that he had to live with for so long, that drove him to go and meet Paul Tatsuguchi's daughter, Laura, ultimately, and then ultimately again her to forgive Dick Laird. Would any of that have happened? It's like you see these footprints of God working through all of those things. And it was, you could say, God leading Paul Tatsuguchi to pen those words, to write that diary that ultimately got spread, across the world, to open up the eyes of American soldiers and others to what Paul Tatsuguchi was like, and to what they thought the enemy was like versus what they really are like, human beings. So, again, our creative works can have an influence in ways that we can't see when we first start on them, that we may never see. But to take heart in the gifts God has given us and to live out the calling through our gifts and talents and our creativity as best we can. To not get too wrapped up in things having to be perfect all the time, but to just go ahead and step into our gifts and talents and live them out, and let God and others take it from there. And some wonderful, wonderful things could very well happen, but if we never step out and do that, if we don't live out our talents and gifts, if we don't live out our creativity, we may never influence lives the way that God has the potential in us to do through us. So A lot of thoughts there to consider, a lot to think about, but that's my afterthoughts for today. Sorry if it ran a little long. Hopefully some of you will be inspired to read The Storm on Our Shores. Again, a brutal book, but also a very poignant one and a moving one. Really less about war, even though that's a big component of it, but more so about the lives of people and learning to forgive and the power of forgiveness to move beyond some of the pains and hurts of life. And the way God works through those things, I think, is definitely an underlying theme there. That's all I got for today. Blessings on the rest of your week, and we'll see you next time on Afterthoughts. Take care. Bye-bye.